This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Journalism and music sometimes sounds like two things that rarely come together, but you have made them to get together because of both your background in music and also in journalism. And to talk about this topic, we're going to be having a conversation with Dr. Eugene Marlow, who was born in London, England. Among his credentials are a master in music composition from Hunter College and a doctorate in media studies from New York University. Today, he's a professor of journalism and writing professions in the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk, Dr. Marlow.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You have a very extensive and diverse professional experience, and in areas as different for many people like journalism and music. Why is that? Why you didn't, as most people, concentrate on one area and actually did a lot of things and continue to do things in different areas?
Let me see if I can answer that question in 50,000 words or less. It's just the way it evolved. I was born into a musical family. My father was a violinist, violist, and even played mandolin for a time. He was a composer and arranger. Towards the end of his life, he was in the string section of the Frank Sinatra Orchestra. My mother studied opera. My grandfather on my father's side was a cellist. My grandfather on my mother's side was a cantor and sang opera. So if you open up my veins, little quarter notes are going to come out. So, music is absolutely in my DNA. The journalism, that kind of happened by accident. When I was 20, by the way, I went to the High School of Performing Arts, and I was a drama major, not a music major. I wasn't actually good enough to be a music major at that time. But I was a drama major. But I went to college and was in the Hunter College choir. But in the midst of all of this, my uncle from England invited me to come over and spend the summer of 1963 with him in England, and they were going to go to the south of France as well. And at the time, there was a lot of talk around the world in the United States about the ugly American. I put that in quotes. And I was sitting in a restaurant with my aunt in Cannes, and there was, I can only assume he was Texan or somewhere from the southern part of the United States, and he had a woman with him, and he was just, could not have been uglier in terms of his attitude and demeanor towards this woman. And I thought to myself, this is the ugly American that they're talking about. And when I came back to the United States, I approached the local newspaper, the Riverdale Press, which actually about 15 years later won a Pulitzer Prize for local community reporting. And I wrote this up with a photograph of myself, and that was my first published article, and I've just continued writing since then. I've written several books, read a lot of articles. So the music and the writing, it's not so much journalism as it is writing than a text, and the journalism, they go hand in hand. The music and the journalism, they really go hand in hand.
Now, the beginning of your career as a writer, you work in the military.
Yes,
writing some military.
That's correct.
Kind of journalism, if you wish. How different is to write for something like the military versus any other type of writings that you can do out there?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was an investigative historian, and I was stationed at a base in California, Castle Air Force Base, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. And this was during the Vietnam era. And at the time, this base was the training base for all crews in Strategic Air Command. That's B-52 bombers, which still exist, and KC-135 tankers. These are the tankers that refuel B-52s and F-15s 33,000 feet up. I went up in one of those missions, and it's scary because one little spark, and that's it, and you're gone. But it was a wonderful experience, and everything I know about organizational communications, I learned from that experience. But I was a bit of an outlier as an Air Force historian. And by the way, at the time, I'm presuming it's still the same. Each base, each wing in the United States Air Force has its own historian reporting directly to the wing commander, not the base commander, the wing commander. So I had a wonderful wing commander, Brian Schatz. He was a full bird colonel at the time. He ended up being a lieutenant general in the Pentagon. Great guy. I was a bit of an outlier because the regulation that governed these kinds of histories, and we had to do a history every quarter, looked at equipment and maneuvers first. And I ultimately turned it around and I put people first. And that completely rewrote the theme, the thread of the histories that I wrote. And these histories had footnotes, bibliography. It was great training for graduate school.
Now, after that, you did a lot of corporate communication as
Yes.
well. And one wonders to what extent it is that different from military, because many people may argue, well, the military is a corporation in itself.
Well, there are politics all over. It doesn't make any difference if it's the military or a nonprofit or a for-profit corporation. The reason I got into corporate communications, and I got into corporate communications through the video production route, is when I was finishing up my MBA out in California, started to take advantage of the GI Bill. A friend of mine pointed to a magazine article about the 3/4-inch video cassette. This is the early 1970s from Sony. And I looked at that and I said, that is the future. That's going to be a happening thing, and it's very new, and I think I can make a mark, with this. I came to New York. I ended up for a year as a news editor on trade publication and mass merchandising, and then I ended up at Citibank co-producing a weekly news show using that technology, and that's how I really got into the video production and the radio production business as well, as it turned out.
And you also did public relations, which is a form of corporate communication, but,
Absolutely.
but more specialized, right?
Yes, absolutely. I ended up in the public relations department at Citibank, and then Prudential Insurance, and then at Union Carbide for about 7 years, where I set up their worldwide video communications network.
And if that wasn't enough in terms of diversity, you also did musical journalism.
Yes. It's, I have spent, or have attempted to spend my life trying to be authentic and being myself and exploring whatever, I was born with. And fortunately, I was born with, several ways to go, and I've attempted to integrate it. And I have to say that coming to Baruch, when I came to Baruch, I have been able to integrate all of those things because I teach journalism courses in music here at Baruch. I'm involved in the Hinton Jazz series, and so I'm able to really be myself here.
Yeah. Well, and also what many people don't realize is the good music journalists are people who actually can read music. And,
it helps.
And it certainly helps, because some people say, okay, he's going to say, I don't like the opera, I don't like the voice of the singer. But actually, it makes a tremendous difference when you do have a training as a musician.
If you have to understand the subtleties, otherwise you're just making a superficial statement. About music journalists and critics. They really know their stuff. They've experienced it directly, either as a composer or specifically as a musician, and so they understand the behind, and that's very important for really good journalism.
The other impressive aspect of your career is that you made a successful transition from printed media to electronic media, something that you're still practicing today. To what extent there are differences between the two in terms of content, not just technology, but content?
The content is the same. It's how that content is delivered. I actually started doing some electronic media when I was in the Air Force because I did some local radio, and I was the guy. They liked my British accent. But the facts are the facts, and it depends on the medium. Really determines how it's delivered. If you read a newspaper, you can go into much greater analytical depth. But if you're doing a news broadcast, especially local news broadcast, you can't go into as much detail. Because the medium doesn't allow it. It has to be very visual. So that really crunches how much information you can put into a piece. In a way, radio, news radio, not what we're doing right now, but news radio is even worse because you only have the oral aspect. You don't have any pictures to go along with it. So I just had my students, they were studying WINS and WCBS News Radio. And they saw almost immediately, each story is about 45 seconds long. How much depth and how much analysis can you put into a piece that's that short? But if you're doing something like what we're doing, you can really have a conversation. If you read something in the newspaper or in a magazine, there's much greater depth there. The unfortunate thing is that we now live in the age of the tweet, where 140 characters and everything is short and quick, and I think part of the problem with journalism today, and the internet is just making it worse, is that people are not getting the kind of in-depth analysis that is really required for a strong democratic process. Yeah. I might add.
Yeah, well, and that brings us a very interesting question, because I would say it is because of that shortening of the message, people have lost a sense of attention span, or is it because we have lost the attention span that has made us to send more shorter messages, or maybe both things at the same time?
Well, I think there's another factor here. Because of electronic technologies, and particularly since World War II, we have all sorts of electronic platforms now. And even more books in print, which is kind of paradoxical. People are being inundated with, in a way, too much information. I'm sure you remember, or you and I will remember 40 years ago when on broadcast television there were 3 networks.
Exactly.
CBS, NBC, ABC. You might want to include PBS in that. And, that was it. You turned on Walter Cronkite and you listened to him for half an hour. And you went to bed at night feeling the world was safe for democracy. But now you have hundreds, maybe thousands of news and information channels, and there's no mass. The country is not sitting around the radio listening to Franklin Delano Roosevelt doing a fireside chat anymore. I mean, we're lucky to get a really large audience for the Super Bowl, maybe the World Series, but we need a lot more than that. It's all niche marketing now. It's all narrow casting, and in a way that's very divisive and make too many audiences. There's too much information, and maybe the tweeters are right. There's not enough time to listen to all of the information. So here it is in 140 characters, but that creates a different kind of mentality and perception of the world.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I also have the sense that because of that massive diversification of the sources of information, also made people to choose what they want to hear or read or learn instead of getting different points of view. And I think that also has been a problem also for democracy.
I think that's absolutely that's correct. I mean, we saw that in the recent election last week, is that people tend to gravitate to those people with whom they agree, who have the same values, and they're not open to a diversity of perspectives. And that the populism that we're seeing in Europe with Brexit and in Germany and other parts of the world has now come home to roost in the United States. I'm calling it a retreat from the future, and it's going to last a while.
Yeah,
it's going to last a while.
Well, let's move now into music.
Okay.
You have done a lot of different things in music as well. I had to write it down because there are too many for me to remember. Classical, jazz, Latin jazz, chamber groups, small jazz combos, big band jazz, concert band. I'm missing any? Oh, those are cover pretty much everything.
You're missing hip hop and rap.
Rap too. Okay.
No. I'm not into. I'm not into that. But they're not on the list because I don't do it.
Okay. Why that? I mean, my father was a musician and he did different genre. And some people ask him, why don't you concentrate just doing one thing, as many very successful musicians have done? So what was the drive behind your interest in trying different styles and different genre?
Oh, several reasons. My father, who was a classically trained violinist, he could do pop music. He did Broadway shows. He was a pretty good improviser. So growing up, I heard a variety of styles, mostly classical, but I heard a variety of styles. When I went back to study music composition seriously, to which I'm grateful to CUNY, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do that. I really came from a jazz background, because when I was much younger, my father took me to a jazz jamboree in London. I think I was 8 or 9 years old, and I heard the Ted Heath Big Band and heard all this jazz, and wonderful. Then I came to the United States, listening to Henry Mancini and the Peter Gunn thematic music. But when I went back to study music composition, I discovered that I could also write classical. So that opened the door, and I said, "Why not? Let's see what I can do here." You know, the notes are all the same. You know, middle C is still middle C, whether it's classical or jazz or Latin jazz or whatever. But when you're writing jazz or you're writing classical, it's just a different kind of a sensibility. It's a different kind of a feel. And you know, why not? You know, why? You know, I have found myself doing some classical things in a big band piece, and I found myself doing some jazz things in a classical piece. So, you know. Was it the 1960s and 1970s? There was a so-called third stream, where several composers trying to put jazz and classical together. I think it was nominally successful, but the concept is, you know, why not borrow from these? At this point, the 21st century is not about either classical or jazz or pop. It's really about world music. So all of these things are, you know, being put into the to the same mix.
Okay. Well, let's listen to one of the examples of the kind of jazz that you practice, this time with the Heritage Ensemble. The name of the piece is Henimato. Did I correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you're going to listen for about just 1 minute of this to get a sense of how you're integrating music from different roots.
Okay.
Okay, now in this piece, you can sense the Hebraic origin of some of the
Easy
melodies.
for you to say, yeah, Hebraic, yeah,
Hebraic.
right.
So the question is, because usually when we hear jazz combining with something else, we think about Latin music, some African music, but I don't think there hasn't been that many attempts of combining jazz with this particular type of music. What prompted you to do that?
Well, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier when I was asked to play this piece. There are actually 2,000 versions of this piece, La Charudie, and I was studying with Harold Danko, a jazz musician in his own right at the time, and I started exploring the jazz chords underneath the melody, and that opened the door to another kind of musical exploration. When I do these arrangements, and we now have, I think, 7 albums out with the Heritage Ensemble, I'm always looking for, well, are there other opportunities in this melodic line? It's really about arranging possibilities. If a piece is in 4/4, can it be done in 3/4 tempo? If it's a up-tempo piece, can it be done as a ballad? And so on. And in this piece, I almost immediately discovered that we could do this as a semi-swing and in a blues style because I changed the chords. And this piece actually is usually the opening piece of our set. So I mean it's really just exploring the possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's listen now to another example of exploration. The title of the piece is I Vino Mulcano.
That's close enough.
Okay, just 1 minute, and you can hear this very interesting piece now. Okay, if I remember clearly, when you play this particular piece, you always say that you don't play it the same way every time. You always some variation on it. So my question to you is that something that you do because you feel that you need to explore something different every time you perform it, or is something another reason behind that?
Well, in this particular piece of Vino Mulcano, this piece is usually sung in a 4/4 tempo, and I heard it in a 6/8 West African bembe tempo. And immediately, it's bembe is a West African rhythmic pattern that was picked up in the Caribbean and so on. But there's room for the saxophonist to improvise, and there's definitely room for the percussionist, the conga player, and the drummer to improvise. And every time a jazz musician improvises, it shouldn't be the same way every time, because that's not improvising. That's as if you're writing out your improvisation and you play it exactly the same way every time. So it's constantly an exploration. And the really great jazz musicians are great improvisers, and I'm very fortunate in my own group to have guys who really know how to improvise.
Now that you mention improvisation, I think most people don't realize that that's actually a subject being taught in a school of music. Because it's not just that you say, okay, now come up with anything that you want. People actually get trained in improvisation. Why is that?
Because if you don't practice improvising, and it is practice, and it is the distance. If you don't practice, and you get on the set in front of an audience of 50 or maybe 500 people, and at that moment you decide, okay, what shall I improvise? The song will be over, and the audience will have left. And really, to improvise well, and it is something that I have to work at all the time. You have to know the scales, different kinds of scales. major scales, minor scales, modal scales. I mean, there are dozens of scales, whole tone scales, so on. You have to know the chords and the different variations of the chords and the different voicings of the chords, and you have to understand how can I juxtapose this chord with something else in the right hand, or vice versa. It's a constant exploration, and I haven't even mentioned technique. You have to be able to, you got 10 fingers, and you have to be able to get around the instrument. Piano, I mean, there are hundreds of piano players much better than me, so I'm constantly listening and constantly trying. You have to explore in practice, because when you get on the set, if you're warmed up enough and you have enough technique, and you're listening to what the other guys and the other players are doing, that could inspire you to go in a different direction. But you got to be ready. You have to be prepared. You can't do it from scratch. It's you have to be you're required to be ready, practiced. It's about practice.
Sure. Well, in fact, some people even argue that some of the best improvisers are people with a very good sense of humor, because sometimes they, put some melodies there that make you feel like, oh, that's really funny to insert that in right there.
Jazz musicians are doing that all that. They're quoting from other pieces,
Exactly.
And if you know the repertoire, it says, oh yeah,
I
he
know
quoted
that
that guy, or maybe he quotes a riff that somebody else has improvised. Or maybe they quote a riff that one of the other soloists on the set has just played, and that means everybody's listening. Improvising is also about listening,
Exactly,
and not just about playing.
Now, you're an European by birth, Brexit or no Brexit. And most people in this country don't realize that jazz is much more popular in Europe than it is in the United States.
Oh, I will expand that even further. I think it's much more popular in Japan and Southeast Asia, and in Europe and Russia, and even in parts of Africa and South Africa. You have, yeah.
Why is that? That's my question. Why is that? How we lost this love for jazz that we used to have?
Well, in a way, places like Europe is the old world. It grew out of the classical tradition. And some of that classical tradition, came over on several boats to the United States. It's a good question. It's a difficult question, because a lot of it is economically driven. I think the arts in the United States is underappreciated, where it is really highly appreciated in Europe, because they've got a much longer arts and culture tradition. I mean, there are countries in Europe that have been secretaries of culture on the cabinet.
Yes.
Where we don't have anything like that in the United States. Places like Japan, I mean, there are hundreds of jazz clubs in Japan. It's very ironic that America's greatest cultural contribution to the world, jazz, which Dr. Billy Taylor used to call America's classical music, was essentially grew out of the African American experience. This is the highly subverted group in this country created this music. It grew out of I'm crunching the history here. Grew out of New Orleans, and then to Kansas City, to Chicago, then to New York, and all over the United States. So this suppressed culture created this great, wonderful music that has been in some ways taken over by white folks. And maybe that's part of the reason why it's underappreciated. I mean, the racism. You can't talk about jazz in this country without talking about racism. Yeah. When a place like the Cotton Club, where Duke Ellington and all of the great bands used to play up in Harlem, they had to come in the back door, and only white folks could come in through the front door.
Yeah.
So, there's still a lot of that going around.
I'm sure. Well, thank you very much for this great conversation with Eugene Marlow about music, journalism, and you name it, because his life has been very diverse and very productive. And next week, we're going to have here Dr. Christopher Hallowell, who will be talking about his experience writing about the environment. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.